To talk more on Kim Jong Il's legacy is Erik Lueth, RBS, a senior regional economist. Well, you know, it wasn't entirely unexpected, but it always comes as a bit of a surprise, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, we knew that he had pancreatic cancer and we knew that he had that stroke, so I think people were preparing for it. Actually, we were looking at it at the time of the attacks last year. You know, how could this scenario unfold that we are now facing?
And it seems that this comes perhaps at a perfect storm in terms of the financial markets, not to be crass, but let's face it, South Korean equity is tumbling, the won is tumbling, bonds there tumbling.
Defense stocks, they're getting a ramp up, apparently, because of these tensions.
Well, as one might expect. But we've got uncertainty in the marketplace. This just adds to it, doesn't it?
No, I think, markets will be unsettled. I wouldn't be surprised for 2 weeks or so. I guess, the fundamental question, the first fundamental question, I guess, would be are there chances of a military attack? We know that these reclusive regimes, when they are vulnerable, they are more likely to strike out. And so I guess one question on everybody's mind is, what are the chances of a military confrontation right now? I thought about that. I think that the fact that this death was pretty much could be anticipated, and the northern regime still engaged in reviving the six-party talks. You know, there were low-level contacts, and that fact tells me that the likelihood of that is not that high. Also, the North usually doesn't have a record of aggression when they are in talks, or even at a low diplomatic level. So I would think that the likelihood of that is not particularly high.
Well, South Korean police officers have been called in for extra duties, but I think we had some troop mobilizations, but that's going to be just good housekeeping. I'm assuming that you've got to do that and just batten down the hatches.
Yes, but obviously the regime will be prickly. I think everybody needs to be, be cautious, restrain themselves. I think it's a vulnerable time.
What I've noted in my multiple trips to Seoul is that, the border, the DMZ, is not that far away from Seoul. And on this peninsula, this Korean peninsula, you have this modern, fast-paced economy that's grown dramatically, transformed, right, into democracy.
And then you went to the north.
And then you go to the north and you just have, this state that is unlike anything you've ever seen before. This is a real threat to South Korea and this successful economic growth story, if North Korea unravels, of course.
I think this is the second big question. What is in store? And I think the other big question is, and I think it's fair to say that the chances of a regime collapse have increased with his death. And, I would see there are two ways how I could see this regime collapse. One would be a coup, a military coup, probably. The other one would be that Kim Jong Il, the successor, embarks on, social, economic or policy reforms, in which case the regime would unravel very, very quickly.
Because of the vested interest is what you're saying, the collapse of that, and they would allow it to happen, essentially.
No, because the regime functions under such a level of oppression that once you give people a little bit of liberty in this situation, which you need for any market economy, it would probably take its course and unravel very quickly. So what I would also urge people to look at is, if you pick up news, markets allowed here, markets allowed there. These kind of are the clear harbingers of regime collapse, in my view. So, yeah.
But you saw last year when Kim Jong Il was introduced to the world, there was a bit of unease, at least from what I read, among the top military leadership there in North Korea, who are essentially old men. These are old guys, and you've got a 25-year-old...
We don't know much about them, but we're just guessing they must be around about 30, late 20s, or Kim Jong Il, that is.
Right, but they seem to have accepted him, from what I understand. They positioned him in such a way to make very clear that he is the one.
Basically, he has also his uncle and his aunt, basically, who are also groomed to kind of protect him. They have very powerful positions. So it's hard to say, but it's really hard to say to look.
He almost left him, Kim Jong Il almost left him with two custodians, essentially, two chaperones, to, show him the levers of power, I suppose. Yes. That's what it is, isn't it?
But to be honest, I think we all know very little about the setup of power there. I wouldn't be surprised even if the intelligence services don't know that much. I guess, as you said, the big question for South Korea is what is going to happen when the regime collapses.
Okay, I mean, does this bring us closer to reunification of the Korean Peninsula?
Yeah, unification is a big word. I mean, first of all, I think one good news is that there is obviously also a chance of complete collapse, civil war, warlordism, this kind of anarchy, which would be the worst outcome.
In a nuclear-armed state.
Exactly. So I would think, given that the state has been very centralized, this is probably not the most likely outcome. Also, if that would happen, I think we would have an international military force take charge because, exactly as you're saying, because of nuclear, how do you call that, spread of nuclear weapons.
Proliferation.
Proliferation, I was looking for that, exactly. So I think, but I would say, so in that case, it would not be a South Korean issue anymore. It would become an international issue. But I think that is still not the most likely scenario. The question is, how about unification? And I think the best benchmark we have probably would be German unification. And I think
it's expensive, isn't it?
Yes, and I think I think that the Korean situation is quite different from the German situation in that North Korea is much bigger relative to South Korea than Eastern Germany was relative to Western Germany. So it was in Germany it was 16 million versus 60 million. In Korea, basically North Korea is half the size of South Korea. Also the per capita income, the relative difference in per capita income is much wider than it used to be in Germany, and also the level of human capital is much lower. So I think that the German-style unification would not work. It would basically bring South Korea to its knees. What I was saying is that I don't think that a German-style unification scenario would work out because of the of the poverty of the state and of the size of the state relative to the South. And so what would work best for South Korea would be a managed association of these states. So it would basically not be fiscal transfers, which would bring up living standards, but they would basically have to rely on FDI. So that would be the...
But they set up a fund which is actually, they put money into...
Billions of dollars.
Yeah, to actually fund a unification.
Yeah, but that fund is still, very small.
It's puny compared to what they'd need, is what you're saying.
It's very small, yeah. And also, I mean, actually I was never very convinced about that fund. I think a more reasonable way actually to build up a fund is first to pay off your debt, right? Because you pay higher interest on your debt than you're earning on your fund. But that apart, so I think FDI would be the way. I guess the big question is, what about migration, right? I mean, one reason that Germany unified so quickly was because the Western Germans said, if we don't bring the German mark to the East will come to the German mark. And so that, I guess, is the big question. Would they be morally also able to keep their brothers and sisters locked up in the poor North?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and one that I ask frequently when I go there, because you have, even though they're part of, in essence, the same cultural background, you have very different social differences, right? I mean, if you've lived under a repressive dictator and your only access to media is state television, the only things you read are state newspapers, just magically integrating into a free market democratic society, hugely complicated. So I think there may be some South Koreans, interestingly, who don't want the North Koreans to come.
There are certainly some West Germans who didn't want East Germans
Absolutely. We need to face that
well.
fact as well. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think that South Korea could shoulder that. I mean, imagine that in your country suddenly your population is not double, but 50% more of your population. That's just not possible. So I guess, but I think there are some reasons why we would expect less migration than we would have expected in Germany. One is that there has been much less contact between North and South than there used to be in Germany. The other one is that the social security system in South Korea is much less developed than it was in Germany. Also, the mere poverty in the North, of course, makes it easy to have early successes, right? I mean, doubling GDP basically is pretty easy at those low levels of development. And then the terrain is also very forbidding between the two. Sorry.
I want to just also talk about the foreign, the role this death has in the region, because, of course, one of Beijing's I wouldn't like to say client states, but it's, Beijing was the only country really, or the only capital, which could really bring to bear influence on Pyongyang. Now, with the regime change, if it is regime change at all, it looks more of the same, just a different person at the top. Now, does that relationship evolve into something else? Will Beijing be able to bring to bear more influence on Pyongyang as a result of the death of Kim Jong Il?
I think, honestly, that Beijing never had a lot of influence. So Professor Lankov, who's really an expert on these things, he used to say that Beijing has a hammer, but it cannot really calibrate North Korea. So what they can do is they can bring down the regime within 3 months. But they don't want that, right? Because then they have all these migrants coming over the border. And they don't really have any means to really fine-tune.
Yeah, what's the upside for them, basically, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think for them it's also a very dangerous period where, you know, they have definitely no interest having U.S. troops, you know, come to their border. They would fear migration. So they are definitely, you know, if there would be a regime collapse, I think probably the Chinese and the Americans would have to be involved also in talks.
If you look at the economic cooperation between North Korea and South Korea, you see these scattered agreements. You know, they do have cooperation, but it's peanuts compared to the kind of deals that China does elsewhere, its economic strength. But it seems that China does this to keep North Korea at bay, right? You know, you give them what they need in the near term, and it's sort of like the troublesome cousin who comes to you for money when they blow their bank account.
And China doesn't want the regime to collapse. I mean, China has no interest to have South Korea, which is a major American ally, directly on its border. I mean, that is quite understandable to some extent.
Kevin Rudd's saying that this could mean, actually, that we enter a period there in North Korea of collective leadership. What does he know that we don't?
I think he's probably referring to what we talked about earlier, about the uncle and aunt putting basically as chaperones behind Kim Jong Il, and I guess that's what he's referring to, rather than China and whoever getting involved.
But keeping it in the family, I mean, you know, the family's views are consistent, right? Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong Il. It's not like, even though Kim Jong-un may have been educated abroad, there's no indication from what I've read that he holds some radically different point of view. In some cases, I've heard suggested that he's even in more hardline.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is we just don't know enough about him. Isn't that the case, Erik?
Yes, I would think so. I should also say we've been talking a lot about regime collapse. You know, even after this death, there is still a very good chance that this regime will still be in power for another 15 years. We know that this regime is not sustainable forever, but if you just keep up the oppression, there is not really a reason why this regime should collapse. I mean, think of again, Eastern Germany. It collapsed the moment when it didn't have Russia's backing anymore. And as we said earlier, China really doesn't have a lot of interest in the regime collapsing for various reasons.
Yeah, as you said, they want U.S. troops, which would be then moving their border, whatever hundreds of miles it is north, and fighting over there.
So if this regime keeps up its brutal oppression, I also, you know, I don't see, there is a good chance that it could remain in power for another 15 years.
We can't underestimate the impact to the people. We talk a lot about the leadership there, Kim Jong Il, of course, and the Workers' Party. But 3 million North Koreans need food assistance in 2012. This according to the UN agencies that oversees this. They go into another difficult winter period. So there is clearly a humanitarian crisis in North Korea that they face each and every year.
Yes, I mean, it's really people starve in North Korea. It's very hard to imagine. I know Professor Lankov, again, he meets people who defect and he talks to them. And it's amazing the stories that you hear. I mean, then there are old women and they say, you know, we heard this thing about the West, that that everybody, I mean, even mothers and children have 1 kilo of rice to eat per day. and that's, you know, that's for them like heaven on earth. That gives you an idea in what kind of circumstances these people are living.
Cut off. I mean, you felt like you'd arrived on the moon when you landed there, didn't you?
And certainly, and I was staying in the best hotel that the government offers its visiting dignitaries and journalists, perhaps to try to impress us or at least keep us under control while we were there. And I can tell you the spread in the dining room was nothing spectacular. So they face a very difficult existence.
I hear one way that North Koreans learn a little bit about the outside world is smuggled CDs. So they like everybody else, they like South Korean soap operas. And apparently there is a very active trade on the border in those DVDs, and that's how they learn a little bit about the outside world. That's what
I mean, getting back to the point, that's how you start to have the cracks appear, but the way that the society is structured, that, you know, if you do something wrong, your entire family is going to be going to jail, and that's quite a responsibility. So that's the way you can maintain absolute authority over the population.
Yeah. I mean, that's the sad truth, that I mean, it would keep the area stable, the region stable, but for the people who live under this regime, obviously, it is disastrous. Yeah.
What does this mean? I mean, it's a bit crass to talk about, but what does it mean? Does it mean anything when it comes to actually looking at the financial markets? What about investing in the south there as well? Does it change anything with regard to that?
I mean, you know, Fitch just reconfirmed Korea's rating, and I guess this is built in. This kind of scenario is kind of built in their scenario. So I guess the one thing that works for South Korea is that it is fiscally very prudent, right? It has debt of 30% of GDP, so it has a lot of fiscal muscle to face the problem. Also, if we would come to a unification or association scenario, North Korea is very rich in commodities and minerals, so that would actually go well with Korea's industries. So.
Okay. Erik, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Erik Lueth there.